Hello and welcome back to part 2 of many of Stephen Recommends fantasy books. If you're new to this channel, I am not a booktuber. I don't normally do book recommendations. I'm normally talking about writing, advice and that kind of thing, interviewing other authors. But people ask me for recommendations of what kind of books they should read within the fantasy genre. And I always say, what kind of stories are you interested in? What kind of subgenre? And then from there I can guide them a little better. So in part 1 I talked about sagas. I'll put a link in here, where I talked about the kind of long, meaty, detailed, huge worlds, many books in a series, or just incredibly rich fantasy sagas that I think you should take a look at if you're into that kind of thing. Today I'm going to talk about some other subgenres that are very, very different, because people like very much different kind of stories and I like a wide variety of fantasy books. So today I'm going to be talking about dark or low fantasy to begin with, and I'll get into that now. The first series is The War for the Rose Throne by Peter McLean. I would recommend this for those who are fans of crime, whether it's TV shows like The Sopranos, whether it's things like Peaky Blinders, crime families, warring for territory, all of that kind of thing. And his series is 4 books and it begins with Priest of Bones. And this is set within a pseudo-fantasy world. Some people have described it as Peaky Blinders but with knives, which I can kind of get that. Basically, a guy comes back from war, him and his brother, and they find that the territory that they ran before they left for the war has been taken over by another rival gang, and now he has to kind of reclaim it. And it's all about this guy, Thomas Piety, trying to claim back his initial territory, and then the story grows out from there. It's not just always about that thing. There's a little touch of magic, but only a little. There are some people in it that have some kind of abilities that some people think is just supernatural. Some people think it kind of comes from some kind of devil or demon or evil entity, in terms of, there isn't God and a devil, but there's those similar kind of deities, and people assuming it's a dark gift. Others think it's something else. So there's that around the edges, but it's really not about the magic. It's about the people, it's about the territory, it's about the relationships. And none of the books are very, very thick. They're kind of 300 pages, 350 maybe. Lean, punchy, tight prose that's sharp enough to cut you on. Really, really interesting, really exciting kind of stories. In a similar vein to those are the Lowtown books by Daniel Polanski. Now these ones do have more magic in, but there again they have the kind of gritty noir, street level urban fantasy that's really dirty and grimy, and it's not people in carriages and going to balls and all that kind of stuff. It's someone in the gutters trying to solve a problem that affects a very small group of people, but obviously the story spills out and it affects other people, and it kind of grows. That what starts out as something very, very small inevitably has much wider implications. And Daniel is really good at that kind of thing, and his Lowtown books start off with a very kind of small story. I don't want to get into too many spoiler territories, and then it spills out to a whole bunch of other places. So those are really, really good. The other books I want to recommend are by Ed McDonald. Now these are a little bit different. They have that kind of lean prose style that I talked about before, really strong characterization, but these are set in a sort of almost post-apocalyptic fantasy world. There are guns, but not in the same sort of way you would think of modern guns. It's more kind of rifles and that kind of thing, but people still carry swords and bladed weapons and that kind of thing. But there are other entities in Ed's books. There are things that are not quite gods. Maybe they are, we're never completely sure. These are supernatural beings as some people regard them and pray to them. Others are just terrified of them and want nothing to do with them. There's a lot of dark in Ed's books that's reflected by some of the kind of brighter moments. They're really grimy and dark, and some people have called them grimdark books, which is, I guess it's a kind of a loose bracket that people put on certain books. But they're really exciting, really interesting, a really, really unique, I would say, Ed's book. And the first one is Blackwing in this trilogy. One of the benefits, and perhaps some people also regard this as a downside of fantasy, is the long-running series aspect, or the trilogy aspect is a kind of very common thing that we have within fantasy. But there are a lot of books that are standalone. You just want to come in, have an adventure, read a book, go somewhere else, do all sorts of wonderful things that you can't do in the real world, and then walk away. And there are lots of books like that. I'm going to recommend one author who did a lot of standalones, but they then built up within this kind of enormous world that he populated with brilliant characters. And he started way back in the 1980s, and this is David Gamel. Now he writes heroic fantasy, larger than life characters, grand speeches, heroic gestures, wonderful people that he populates his books with. And most often they're really complicated characters. They're not white hats and black hats. Some people regard fantasy in a very kind of primitive way, and they say, goodies and baddies, white hats and black hats. Gamel is probably the best person, I would say, of my generation in terms of readers, that when we think about what some people call grimdark these days, I would look to him and say he was doing it long before that term came up. And what I mean by that is he was writing stories about ordinary people, some of them with extraordinary gifts, being thrust into awful situations that they can't just walk away from, and trying to make the best of it. Just do the best they can, survive and get through this thing. And he wrote great adventures like that. And The Legend is the first book, and it's not a spoiler because it's all about this great siege where an old warrior, Druss, is called out of retirement for one final battle to inspire people, to lead them in what seems like a doomed battle against an enormous enemy horde. And he's there to lead them, to hopefully help them get through this terrible thing. And that spawned a number of other books within that same world, and then Gamel did other books in different worlds, lots of standalones. He did do some trilogies later on, so you can check them out. And if you enjoy that kind of heroic fantasy aspect, I would also recommend James Barclay, who did write trilogies. Start with his Raven books, set about a group of mercenaries. There's lots of magic in his books and in Gamel's books, whether it's mages or dark magic or other things that kind of fall somewhere within the scope of it. James Barclay writes elves, dwarves, humans with fantastic magic and dragons and all of that kind of stuff. So really grand stories that are heroic fantasy, I would say. So definitely check them out if that sounds like your kind of thing. There are some authors that do completely their own thing, that after a while, when that person puts out a book, it's not often in a series, or if it is, it becomes something that is just completely their own. Someone won't say something like, I'm waiting for the next Wheel of Time book. They'll just say, I'm waiting for the next Neil Gaiman book. And whatever it is, they will buy it because they know his kind of style of stories, and whatever the genre and whatever the subject, it'll be something different and unique. And that's what they're interested in. The voice of that author tackling something, looking at something. And there are a couple of authors like that within the fantasy space. Obviously, Neil Gaiman. He has done all sorts of weird books, from American Gods, which tackles really complicated stuff in the modern day to do with old gods from Europe coming across to America with the settlers and what happens to them, and then the new gods that emerge. And it's set within the present day, and it pulls on mythology, and there's lots of supernatural things to do with that. But then he's done books like The Graveyard Book, which is a very lean book about a young boy who lives in a graveyard. And he's done Coraline, and he's done Anansi Boys, and he's done more recently books around mythology, Norse mythology, his kind of retelling with his own spin. He did The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which is a really difficult book to describe. He wrote, of course, Good Omens back in the day with Terry Pratchett. And his next book, you just have no clue what it's going to be, but some people will pick it up sight unseen because he has that kind of unique feel. And another author like that within the fantasy space is Lavi Tidar. He writes some of the most challenging, interesting, thought-provoking, weird, wonderful and unexpected fantasy books I've ever come across in my life. He is not like any other writer. I can't point at him and say, oh, he writes kind of sagas, or he writes kind of... No, he doesn't. He just doesn't. I previously talked about in my holiday video, which I'll put a link to here, that I'd read his King Arthur book By Force Alone, and then I took away The Hood to read, which was about Robin Hood. This is his Antimatter Quartet of Britain. Retellings, reimaginings of historical figures done in completely his own way. And now I love King Arthur books. My favourite King Arthur trilogy was written by Bernard Cornwell. And I was curious to see what Lavi Tidar would do. totally not expecting it whatsoever. Completely weird, impossible. There's a bunch of stuff in there that's so radical and weird that no one would ever put that in a King Arthur book, unless you're him. But then there's a bunch of things in there that when you get to the end and you read the afterword, he talks about the sources that he pulled on were very, very different to what a lot of people do with King Arthur books, which is pull on the kind of romanticised version. So there again, he has such a unique perspective. He's worth checking out if you want something that's not like anything else out there. The next subgenre I want to talk about is kind of light fantasy, where there's a lot of jokes, a lot of heart. There is some darkness in these stories, some of the ones I'm going to talk about, but there's a more humorous view of fantasy. Now, it's not making jokes of the genre, it's just there's a comedic vein running through the books. And now, obviously, the most recent one I can probably talk about is Nicholas Eames did Kings of the Wild and The Bloody Rose, the first two books in his series, where the first one is very much mercenaries are regarded in the same way as kind of rock star bands are, and it focuses on a retired group of mercenaries kind of coming back out retirement for one last gig or one last tour, as you know, kind of imagine, and they're going to do a job. They're kind of aging warriors going to try and rescue someone's daughter, and it has that 70s 80s pop, heavy metal, rock vibe, and there's references in there and little nods to lots of things, and there's a lot of humour in there. So that's a really good series to start with. Jonathan French wrote the Grey Bastard trilogy, and this is about half-orcs that ride giant hogs, so kind of like biker gangs as it were, but they're these half-orcs on these enormous kind of beasts that they ride around, war pigs kind of thing. Really good, really interesting. They're both very lean books, both Nicholas Eames and Jonathan French series. They're both very kind of punchy, great characterization, lots of good stories and one-liners and interesting characters. But Jonathan has done some really interesting twists on some of the kind of typical fantasy races. He's taken them and just twisted them ever so slightly and made them something really, really unique. And I really enjoyed that series. So he's really, really interesting in terms of his point of view as a storyteller. And of course, the one I have to recommend is David Ragg. He wrote The Black Hawks and the Righteous. That duology is out now and done. And his new book set within the same world many years later, which is starting a new trilogy, is The Hunters. Now, they're very interesting books. There is a lot of humour in his books, but they're not comedic in the same way as the other probably two series I've mentioned. There is a lot of darkness, there is a lot of heart, there is a lot of thought, and also there's always something under the surface. Dave is really interesting at writing this book as a story about one thing, but there's lots of other things going on. You can read the surface of the story and just have a great adventure with some fun, but it's actually always talking about something else. He's analysed something else. But the books are light. There again, they're not huge tomes. The Black Hawks and the Righteous is a duology and it's done, and then the new book is the start of a trilogy, but they're really, really different to any of the kind of other genres of books that I've talked about thus far in this video and the previous video. The last book in series that I wanted to talk about, set within this kind of subgenre, I really can't say subgenre, is The Lies of Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is the start of a much longer series. However, you can read The Lies of Lamora as a standalone and it works incredibly well. And for me, it's one of the best fantasy books of the last 25 years. Imagine Oliver Twist grew up and became a con man in an analogue of Venice, and he runs his own gang. That's kind of what it is. Locke is this cheeky little scallywag who was an orphan, who stole as a boy, grew up, and now we have the story of him as a man working for one of these criminal gangs set within a pseudo fantasy world. Very, very funny, incredible world building, incredible characterization, lots of humour without it being too over the top. Very rich world. The book is about 550 pages. It's not a huge one. It doesn't feel weighty. It doesn't feel difficult. And there are 3 books out in the series, but you can read Lies by itself. And it has the flashbacks to when Locke was a boy and you find out more about him, and then that feeds into the story in the present. And it's absolutely brilliant. The way it's written, the characterization, the world building. As I said, for me, it's one of the best books that I've read in the last 25 years. It is that good. Second book series is interesting, but it's very, very different. It's then set on pirate ships, and the third one is different again. So that it kind of moves within the genre. But this first book sits comfortably, I think, alongside some of the other ones that I've mentioned because of the tone of the book. Each character is very, very different. They're very relatable. And as well, each of the authors that I've talked about so far in this subgenre has a very different voice from the other ones. So there's some commonality, there's some common tissue, but their styles are very different and the approach stories and characters very different. So it's definitely worth checking out at least one of them that I've spoken about in this kind of comedic-ish subgenre. Okay, I really have gone on way longer than I thought it would, so I'm going to wrap up part 2 here, and I'll come back in the future and do a part 3 that I want to talk about and recommend. See you later.